Well, a warm welcome to Philippe Legrain, who you had a short CV in your invitation. And Philippe has a long and very distinguished career in journalism, in writing about economic policies, serving in the Commission as advisor to Mr. Barroso, then leaving with certain noise about that you were leaving, and now you have written a book about the mess we are in and what to do about it. And as I understand it, you are also trying to mobilize people in order to see that something happens about this, what we are supposed to do to get out of the mess. So please, the floor is yours.
Thank you for that kind introduction, and it's good to be here. As has already been alluded to, the Eurozone is in a mess. Catastrophic mistakes by Eurozone policymakers, primarily Angela Merkel's government in Berlin, the ECB in Frankfurt, and the European Commission in Brussels, have transformed a financial crisis into a much deeper economic and political one. Without a change of policies, the Eurozone seems set for prolonged stagnation as it sinks into a deflationary debt trap, causing continued misery and potentially devastating political consequences. Yet there is deep confusion about the nature of the Eurozone's problems and huge political obstacles to the policy changes that are needed. It's tragic. Now, the Eurozone has already suffered a longer and deeper recession than the United States, which has been growing since 2010, and a longer slump than Europe in the 1930s. The Eurozone's least bad performer, Germany, has grown by only 3.6% since early 2008, and that is half of what Sweden, Switzerland, and the United States have achieved. The Eurozone's worst performer, Greece, has shrunk by a quarter and is doing worse than Germany did during the Great Depression. And overall, the Eurozone economy is still 2.4% smaller than it was in early 2008. And now, it's not recovering, it's stagnating. In the second quarter, growth was 0. The economy was only 0.7% bigger than 12 months earlier, while the economies of Germany and Italy shrank. Inflation has tumbled to 0.3%, and prices are falling across Southern Europe. Deflation looms. Many people have suffered sharp falls in their living standards, not least 18 million unemployed. The jobless rate of 11.5% has barely fallen from its peak, and unemployment is scarily high in some countries. 1 in 4 Greeks and 1 in 4 Spaniards are unemployed. And across the Eurozone, 1 in 4 young people are out of work. Nearly 40% in Portugal, more than 40% in Italy, and more than 50% in Greece and Spain. A lost generation of young people is in the making. And depressingly, most Europeans think that younger generations will have a worse life than they do. The present pain and fear of the future are poisoning politics too. Social tensions within countries are multiplying, as are political frictions between them. Understandable anger at the injustice of bailouts for rich bankers and their creditors and budget cuts for poor school children overlaps with a despicable scapegoating of outsiders, notably immigrants. Catalans want to split from Spain, as Scots almost did from Britain. Old stereotypes have been revived and new grievances created. So Germans slander Greeks as lazy good-for-nothings, while bombs go off when Angela Merkel visits Athens. Nasty nationalism is on the march again. Support for the project that binds Europeans together, the European Union, has never been lower. And the euro itself is increasingly perceived as a sadomasochistic straitjacket. Most Europeans now associate the EU with austerity, recession, and German domination, with undemocratic constraints on what they can do, rather than how we can all achieve more together. And people have also lost faith in the competence, motives, and even the honesty of establishment politicians, EU technocrats, and elites in general, who failed to prevent the crisis, who seem incapable of resolving it, and who bailed out the banks while imposing misery on ordinary voters, but not on themselves. And this anti-establishment, anti-EU, and anti-foreigner mood is fertile ground for extremists and charlatans who did exceptionally well in the recent European elections. So the big picture is this: threatened from within by xenophobes and nationalists, and from outside by Putin's Russia, our open societies, post-war Europe's most amazing achievement, are at risk. Now, the cause of the Eurozone's prolonged economic weakness is this. 7 years after the first bank in the Eurozone failed and was bailed out by the German government, the Eurozone remains stuck in a balance sheet recession, with broken banks, a huge overhang of private sector debt, and a big shortfall of demand. Households, companies, and banks are all trying to repair their balance sheets at once. And governments, instead of accommodating the private sector's desire to save more by borrowing more itself, or accelerating the process by restructuring debts, governments are compounding the problem by trying to borrow less at the same time. Now, a simplified way of explaining it is this. Households aren't spending because their wages are stagnant and because they're trying to pay down huge debts. Since consumers aren't spending, companies aren't investing. Governments are cutting back too, albeit much less so than in 2010, 2012. As a result, domestic demand is depressed. And since Eurozone economies mostly export to each other, each country's depressed domestic demand is someone else's depressed export demand. So the Eurozone is relying entirely on demand from the rest of the world in order to grow. But the Eurozone is too big, and growth elsewhere is too weak for this to generate a strong enough recovery to be able to pay down debt and bring down unemployment. And the process is, of course, partly self-limiting, because the Eurozone's huge and expanding current account surplus naturally causes the euro to appreciate, which partly undoes the export gains. Now, undeniably, the Eurozone also has severe, long-standing supply-side problems. Cartelized product markets, ossified labor markets, rigged and often subsidized land markets, and bloated and often inefficient public sectors. Over the past decade, the Eurozone's productivity growth has averaged only 0.9% a year, which is half that in the United States. On top of that, there is dismal demography. The Eurozone's working age population is no higher than in 2008 and has been shrinking since 2011. But even if we assume that the Eurozone's trend rate of growth is as little as 1% a year, it should have still have grown by 6% since 2008. Instead of that, it has shrunk by 2.4%. So clearly then, the Eurozone's biggest problem is deficient demand. Now that might seem obvious, but until Mario Draghi's speech in Jackson Hole in August, Eurozone policymakers didn't even recognize that the Eurozone had a demand problem. So while supply-side reforms are absolutely crucial to boost productivity and future growth, they are not a substitute for policies to boost demand now. Indeed, they cannot succeed unless they are accompanied by measures to fix the banking system and boost investment. So, that's where we are now. How did the Eurozone get into this almighty mess? Now, as you know, there was a huge credit boom across the Western financial system, from the United States to Iceland, in the years up to 2007. It involved a massive expansion of cross-border lending by dysfunctional and often dangerously undercapitalized banks, abetted by the complacency and sometimes the complicity of central bankers, regulators, supervisors, and politicians. And Eurozone banks were right at the heart of it. As well as gambling on American subprime mortgages, German, French, and to a lesser extent Dutch banks lent too much, badly, to Spanish home buyers and property developers, to Portuguese consumers, and also to the Greek government, both directly and together with local banks. And when the bubbles burst and banks went bust, governments decided to bail them out without forcing them to clean up their balance sheets. As a result, the Eurozone now has state-sponsored zombie banks that use the cheap liquidity provided to them by the ECB to roll over their bad loans to zombie companies while denying affordable credit to new borrowers. And the flip side of failing to force banks to clean up their balance sheets is that households and companies still have huge and often unpayable debts. Now, until 2010, governments were at least supporting the private sector's desire to save more by borrowing more themselves. But after Greece's public debt problems came to a head in early 2010, Eurozone policymakers wrongly decided that the Eurozone as a whole faced a generalized fiscal crisis and embarked on premature, excessive, collective austerity that caused such deep recessions that perversely public debt soared. And when policymakers' subsequent mistakes sparked a panic that almost destroyed the Eurozone, they responded by demanding ever greater austerity, until finally the ECB, after long insisting that it was legally unable to act, intervened to quell the panic in the summer of 2012. And since then, bond yields have plunged, austerity has been eased off, and economies have stabilized. But they have not recovered because the underlying causes of the economic weakness have not been tackled. The broken banks, the private sector debt overhang, and the more general shortfall of demand. And this flawed and unjust crisis response has also created new obstacles to resolving the crisis. Because when it became clear in 2010 that Greece could not repay its debts, they should have been written down. Instead of that, to avoid losses for German and French banks, Chancellor Merkel, together with a trio of Frenchmen, President Sarkozy, Dominique Strauss-Kahn at the IMF, and Jean-Claude Trichet at the ECB, decided to pretend that Greece was merely going through temporary funding difficulties, And under the pretense that the financial stability of the Eurozone as a whole was at risk, they decided to breach the legal basis on which the Eurozone was founded, the no bailout rule, and to lend to the Greek government so that it could repay those French and German banks. And in the case of Ireland, Portugal, and Spain, the EU loans were primarily to bail out local banks that would otherwise have defaulted on their loans from French and German banks and other financial investors. So as a result of these bailouts, the bad lending of private banks has become obligations between governments. Thus, a crisis that could have united Europe in a collective effort to curb the banks that got us into this mess has instead divided it, pitting creditors, principally Germany, against debtors, with EU institutions becoming instruments for creditors to impose their will on debtors. In effect, the Eurozone has become a glorified debtor's prison. And to pursue their misguided aims, Eurozone policymakers have behaved outrageously. They forced the prime ministers of Italy and Greece to resign. The unaccountable troika abused crisis-hit countries' need for liquidity to impose all sorts of often misguided policies on them. And policymakers threatened to deprive the Greeks and the Irish of the use of their own currency, the euro, unless their government accepted punitive conditions. So like Weimar Germany, Greece has been forced to accept brutal austerity to try to continue servicing an unbearable debt burden. Irish taxpayers have been lumbered with a 64 billion euro bill, that is 14,000 euros for every person in Ireland, for their bank's bad debt. Now think about it. Taking advantage of other Europeans' desperate desire to be part of Europe and their fear of being forced out of the euro to impose iniquitous conditions on them is the very opposite of the solidarity on which the European project is meant to be based. So it is tragic, but hardly surprising, that as a result, Germany and EU institutions are now resented so much. And the upshot is that European policymakers now have an incentive to resist the debt relief that Greece needs to recover. They would also lose out if the 64 billion euro debt imposed on Ireland was written down. In effect, by putting the interests of the banks ahead of those of ordinary citizens, Merkel and other Eurozone policymakers have set Europeans against each other. The Eurozone is also now locked in to a stifling and undemocratic fiscal straitjacket, much tighter EU fiscal rules, as well as the fiscal compact. These tighter rules were unnecessary because the EU's Stability and Growth Pact did not fail, except in failing to spot Greece's lying. The crisis was caused by failures in financial governance, not fiscal governance. But because Merkel made that mistake of breaching the no bailout rule, German taxpayers suddenly felt they were on the hook for everybody else's debts. So she demanded much greater control over other countries' budgets, and the European Commission was only too happy to grab new powers. Now that is economically dangerous because countries that share a currency need greater flexibility, not less. And it's politically poisonous because whenever voters reject a government, as they have done at almost every occasion during the crisis, the first thing that happens, even before the new government is in place, is that Olli Rehn, and now his successor, Jyrki Katainen, pops up on television and says, you must stick to exactly the same failed policies of the government you have just rejected. And that remote, unaccountable officials in Brussels should deny voters legitimate choices about taxation and spending, which are at the heart of national democracy, alienates people from the EU. And if voting for mainstream parties does not deliver change, it is no surprise that people vote for extremists instead. So while it is good that some of the previous policy mistakes have been reversed, new obstacles to resolving the crisis have also been created. As I said, northern taxpayers now have an incentive to resist debt relief for southern Europe. The failure to write down debts is leading to deflation, whose tackling may require exceptional policies that offend Germans' monetary taboos. The new fiscal straitjacket poses legal and political constraints to the investment policies that the Eurozone needs. And the antagonism between North and South, the broader resentment of a quasi-hegemonic Germany, institutional fatigue, and the corrosion of support for the EU precludes desirable future integration. And because today's chronic misery seems less pressing than the acute financial panic that is abated for now, and because Germans themselves aren't suffering enough to feel that things need to change, there is a complacency and lack of urgency among policymakers who are often detached from those who suffer the consequences of their decisions, as well as unaccountable to them. Now, you look at the debate in Brussels. Germany says, like a mantra, we need fiscal consolidation and structural reform. France says we need to borrow, and Italy say we need to borrow a bit more and we'll do a bit more reform. The new president of the Commission says we need 300 billion euros in investment, but so far there's no money for it. Meanwhile, the ECB continues to pump liquidity into Eurozone banks, even though the real problem is not a lack of cash, but the bad debts on their balance sheets. And markets pin hope on QE, involving large-scale purchases of government bonds, even though this is extremely unlikely because of Germans' hostility to it, and it's debatable how much good it would do. So what do we need to do to solve the crisis? We need to do what I advised President Barroso when I first met him back in October 2010. Restructure the banks, write down unbearable debts, both public and private, and combined increased investment with reforms to boost productivity. And Germany also needs to play its part in the necessary adjustment by paying workers for their increased productivity and by investing more instead of suppressing wages in order to artificially try to boost its competitiveness. And likewise, for struggling southern European countries whose traditional exports have been undermined by Chinese competition, the solution is not to try and slash wages to compete with China. It's to invest in moving up the value chain to produce new and better things for higher wages. And last but not least, the Eurozone needs institutional reform in order to be able to work better in future. Instead of a Eurozone caged by Germany's narrow interests as a creditor, we need a monetary union that works for all its citizens. A genuine banking union with a robustly independent banking supervisor, not the bogus partial banking union we have now. The ECB mandated to be a lender of last resort to prevent future panics. The no bailout rule restored, and with it much greater fiscal flexibility, disciplined, of course, by markets and ultimately by the threat of default. And ideally, we should create a Eurozone treasury, accountable to both European and national legislators, with limited tax raising and borrowing powers. Ultimately, the freer, fairer, and richer Eurozone that would emerge would be in Germany's enlightened self-interest too. Thank you.
Thank you very much for a very comprehensive analysis, and at the end, some constructive proposals to go from here. I would, in the interest of time, ask the panel to come up. First commentator, panelist is Leif Pagrotsky, who is in no need of presentation here.
Hello. Well, I too would like to thank you for this very clear and persuasive lecture on the mechanisms behind this crisis and how we ended up here. But my role is to be a commentator, and I would like to, I have to try to find some area where there are nuances between us. And I would like to start by dwelling a bit upon one of them. In order to fix a problem, it helps if you understand where the problem emanates from and what the source of the problem is. And in addition, that you have an honest attitude in looking at it in an unprejudiced way, in a clear and honest way. And I think you have come a long way, but I would like to look at it a little bit different. I think we should ask the fundamental question, what has gone wrong? Is this a failure of individuals, the failure that we see in the present state of Europe today? Is it a failure of individuals, bankers, politicians, regulators, or is it a failure that is systemic? Is this a big number of individuals who suddenly, after 1999, became stupid, became incompetent, became blind, and triggered all these mechanisms that you described: exaggerated lending, housing bubbles, fiscal irresponsibility, lending to governments, accumulating debts that were completely undefensible. As you can understand from the way I put the question, my view is that this is a systemic problem, not a problem of failed individuals. And I think the systemic problem is that when you created the monetary union, you took away the right to raise or lower interest rates from individual economic policymakers. And that is a fundamental element of every monetary union, of course. But once you do that, you enter into a risk zone where things like these can hardly be avoided when things start to go wrong. And I would like to illustrate it with the two kinds of problems that we faced in the Eurozone. The first one is the one associated with country names like Ireland and Spain, who suddenly, in a period of very rapid growth, high inflation, rapid wage increases, on top of that, experienced suddenly German interest rates. And of course, a bubble must come from such a combination of events. It cannot be avoided. There is no such thing as fiscal policy or regulatory policy that can prevent this avalanche to happen once you have established those starting conditions. And then you end up in the bubble collapsing, and when a bubble collapses, banks collapse. We all know it. And that can happen outside monetary unions as well, as we know in Sweden, where this happened in the early 90s. In Latvia, where it happened banks went almost bankrupt. It was Swedish banks, so they were a bit too big for those small countries to create bankruptcies. But we know this mechanism very well. The other channel through which the systemic problem of the monetary union worked was related to country names like Greece and Italy, where you have dramatically, I would say, mismanaged economic policies or national policies for a very, very long time. When you enter into a monetary union, all the normal warning signals carried into the information of prices, the price that we call interest, when those signals are abolished, and they all get to German signals, the normal breaks that could bring an end to such periods are taken away. And they could continue for a long period of time before new breaks were added. In the case of Greece in 2010, and in Italy, we are seeing it at a later time. I see this too as not a problem of individuals, but as a problem that is systemic. On top of this, we had the other element that I think must be present if you want to solve problems. You must have an intellectual and honest, must have an honest intellectual attitude. And when the guardians of the system and those in charge of policies in the euro area had as their prime identification to defend and excuse this holy system, then you cannot expect rational policies to come out of the blue to people who do not want to see that there is a problem in this fantastic project that they spent their lives in proposing. So that, I think, is part of the systemic element here, that this whole construction of this monetary union has created conditions that made this situation as bad as it is. And as a consequence of this, we now have this legacy that you described in very clear details about unemployment, about political developments and so on. But I would like to frame it a little bit different. We have two enormous imbalances now. An imbalance of competitiveness between competitive countries and uncompetitive countries, and we have an imbalance of debtors and creditors, indebted nations and nations that have lent money to the other nations. And I must say that these two are, at the present time, not improving, but worsening. There are vicious circles aggravating the situation year by year. And the dynamics is scary. And I must say that I see no indications whatsoever that there is a turnaround around the corner in any of these two vicious circles. If I have one more minute, do I? Let me say one thing about the element that you described about the democratic choices of nations. The Troika or somebody else comes and tell the people from, say, France or Spain, that you may vote for the opposition who are against all the policies of Sarkozy or whoever it is, and you can change the government, but the new government must deliver the same policies. You will be disappointed with the new prime ministers and new finance ministers, but it doesn't matter because they have no other choice than to pursue the policies that you voters disapproved of in the hands of their predecessors. And then, of course, the reaction is, if they pretend that we have the freedom to vote in a democratic election, of course, a reaction can be to vote for somebody who's totally against the system. And in a political climate where nationalism is rising, and mind you, the nationalism is not only rising in countries in this situation, in the Eurozone. Nationalism is on the rise in Norway, Sweden, Finland, Russia, Hungary, Turkey, many different places. But in areas like this, when they have Brussels as a symbol of the outside world interfering in our domestic business and making our democracy useless, of course, this aggravates an already difficult situation. And that's where we are today. And I think the situation is very, very pessimistic. And I'm sorry not to have any prescriptions for how to get out of this problem. Many of the things you proposed were very good. I would like to add that I would support them, but I cannot see political conditions for boosting demand in Europe. I don't understand how that should be brought about, or how to bring more investment to the south to raise productivity more than productivity is rising in the north. And so the competitiveness gap will continue to widen. Thank you.
Thank you, Leif. Harry Flam, could I ask you to contribute with your comments over there?
I need to say to Philippe and the audience that I wrote this before you spoke, because I'm going to sound a little bit repetitive. It was known, of course, at the outset of the monetary union that there is a danger that real exchange rates, competitiveness, will come misaligned over time. And the no bailout rule was maybe the major instrument to prevent that from happening. And we thought that that would put enough discipline on governments to pursue prudent, responsible macroeconomic policies. Well, that didn't happen. What went wrong? Well, as we've heard already, we had a big credit boom, especially in countries where inflation and interest rates had been very high and which previously had relatively small credit markets. Now they had access to a big credit market and credit at very low German interest rates. So we had a credit boom, both in the private sector and in a couple of cases in the public sector. We had banks lending to households, and we now know the consequences. Because of the credit boom, we had real exchange rates misalignments arising. At the peak, I think in 2008 or 2009, the real exchange rate of Greece, for instance, and Ireland in 2007 had risen about 30 to 35% above that of Germany, for instance, if you start in 1999. And that, of course, is an unsustainable situation. What brought about the euro crisis, of course, was the US housing market and the financial crisis that arose out of that. But we would have had the problems that we have had in the euro area, even without, I think, the financial crisis coming from the US. The major mistake taken was taken in May 2010 when the Euro countries decided to bail out Greece. And I don't really know what the thinking was, but I guess there is a temptation when somebody comes to you that you've lent money to and says that right now I can't repay, but if you give me a chance, you'll get your money back later. That the German and the French governments thought that maybe they could avoid having their banks and ultimately their taxpayers pay for all the reckless lending to Spain and Greece and so forth. But they were wrong, whatever the thinking was. And the result of the Greek bailout and the successive bailouts after that has been that we have a huge moral hazard problem in governments, in the private sector, among households. And we have huge fights about burden sharing, who should pay for all the bad debt that we have in banks and so forth. So what should be done in this mess? And I think there are three things that have to be done. The first one is debt restructuring. Debts have to be written off. And this is going to happen anyway, sooner or later. And of course, it's much better to do it sooner than later. And this includes, of course, recapitalizing banks. The second thing that needs to be done is to dismantle, I think, the whole system of rescue funds and the institutions that have been created. Because they run completely against the original thinking of the no bailout clause, which I think is profoundly sound, that the market should discipline the private sector, households and governments. And that means that the burden will be on those who behave irresponsibly or take the wrong decisions, and on no one else. And we will avoid a lot of political disputes and resentments and so forth if we had stuck to the no bailout rule. And finally, the third thing that has to be done is to have a coordinated fiscal stimulus in the Eurozone and the whole of Europe. And although that sounds improbable, Leif was very pessimistic, I think that has to be done. And it has to be done in a reasonable manner where those who can afford to do more have to do more. Germany foremost, of course. And those are my prescriptions. And I should maybe stop with adding the hope that the whole monetary union will live on, because I basically believe in the monetary union and the benefits. We should not forget about the benefits.
Thank you. Sorry, we open the floor for discussion. Now, Johanna Lybeck-Lilja will introduce us to a rather technical but very important aspect, and that's the banking union, where work is going on. And Philippe also referred to the need for a real banking union. So now we'll know what a real banking union is, or where we are when it comes to real banking union. Please, Johanna.
I hope so. After this. This is by far the most complicated thing I ever negotiated in Brussels, and I'm supposed to do this in like 10 or maximum 15 minutes, so it's going to be interesting.
10, please.
And that's why I'll skip my first, if Philippe is still here somewhere, I would... No, Philippe, I was talking about Peter, I'm sorry. I would say in financial market regulation, we moved far away from your vision of the union. It's becoming much more detailed on the EU level than we've had before. But the banking union, as we know, it's mandatory for Eurozone countries, and other EU member states can join if they wish. So it's based on 3 pillars. The first one is the centralized supervision. A single supervisory mechanism, that's the ECB, has been given this task. They will start in November now. So I should also say, why did the banking union come up as an idea? Well, for some people, I think it was the urge of becoming an ever closer union, sort of building the Euro project further. For others, and you can understand which countries that was, it was distrust in some member states, capabilities to do supervision and crisis management properly. So I think we had 2 sort of driving forces to this. The 2 other pillars, it has to do with resolution of banks in trouble. The first one being a common resolution authority. That's the single resolution board. It will be a separate supranational authority, the SRB, and a common fund to finance the resolution costs. The fund will be built up in 8 years and become increasingly mutualized over that time. So first, starting off, you have your own national compartment, and then in the end of 10 years, or 8 years, it will be completely mutualized. There were discussions of a 4th pillar, a common deposit guarantee scheme. That has been shelved for now. The Commission didn't dare to put forward a proposal, simply because we look too different in the Union. In many countries, the deposit guarantee system, where you actually get your money back if the bank fails, the money you deposited in the bank, in some countries or in many countries, that's a private scheme run by private banks and not a government scheme, as in, for example, Sweden. And yet again, in other countries, they have several schemes. They have one scheme for local banks, one scheme for savings bank, one for commercial banks, and so forth. So it was deemed too hard to get a common scheme. My point is that whatever you do with this, it has to be the same level. Either everything, supervision, resolution, and financing, is at the national level, or everything goes to the European level. You can't have a mix of the two. Why is that? Let's take a large Swedish bank, and we just have supervision at the EU level, but the rest on the national level. That means that the ECB would supervise the bank in good times, and as soon as there's trouble, they just give it back to the national authorities. That wouldn't work. Let's take a situation where we give up supervision at the national level and give it to the EU level, and also resolution. Well, what happened? The bank is supervised by the ECB. The decision how to manage and the decisions around the bank in a crisis would also be for the EU level, and the Swedish authorities just pick up the bill. That is not okay. So that's why I'm saying whatever you do, everything should be at the same level. There are two things you need to know about the banking union. Two things you need to remember. The first one is this is an extremely complex and complicated decision-making process. This picture was drawn by a German European parliamentarian named Sven Giegold. It might be that all the aspects are not completely accurate, but trust me, it is equally complicated as he describes it. And just to do this simple, the whole process starts with the ECB identifying a bank that is failing or likely to fail. They send the message to the Single Resolution Board, and there we have a really problematic situation. There are different compositions for different decisions, different voting rules. I have a slide on this, I won't show it because it's the worst thing I've ever seen. There will be so many fights about who is to take the decisions with which voting modalities whenever there's a problem. My problem with this is that in many cases, the decision can be made by 5 civil servants and no member states present. And there I have a problem with accountability. Then we have a loop, or actually 2 loops, going to the Commission and the Council. And as you understand, this is not done over a weekend. It's too many actors to be done in a quick way. Then the decision just goes down to the national authority, just do it. So that's the decision-making process. The second thing you need to know is called the waterfall. The waterfall is about who pays for the costs that arise when a bank goes bust. Well, this looks like a long and nice list, and it could be. First of all, shareholders and bondholders, that's obvious, they pay for the risk they've taken. Then we have a lot of parts of the mutual fund, your own part, a part of the mutual fund, then you go back to your own part, and then you can borrow from somebody else. The problem is, the fund, when it's fully built up, is only going to be 1% of covered deposits. That's 55 billion euros. I'm sorry, it covers one large bank in Europe, nothing else. So even if this list looks long, we will very soon end up in the areas here where we need to get more money from the banks, which are already in crisis. Then they cannot support the economy. We need to borrow from somebody else. We need to borrow in the market. So all of these issues here are not really clear on how it will work. So my prediction is that when we get into a huge crisis, it's not going to be clear-cut who is going to pay and how is this going to work. So this is a problem. And then we have this national financing sources. Nobody's told me what the national financing sources is. Is it government budget money or what is it? We don't really know. And then money from the ESM. Well, if you're a non-euro country, you cannot join the ESM. So that won't be available for us. And it's added somewhere that the fund can borrow in the market. Well, then you need public guarantees, otherwise you have to pay too much. So here again, taxpayers will be involved, or at least I cannot rule out the risk that taxpayers will be involved. The Swedish position is that we we'll take our decision when all parts are finalized. I would say now they are finalized. However, I'm not with the government anymore, so it will be for the new government to take this decision. But we had several requirements going into negotiations. We saw that many European countries were extremely lax on having requirements on banks, and I think you alluded to the need to have capital. So we requested that if you join the banking union, the capital requirements should be set by the national state, and we achieved that. We also said if we are to join, we want the same influence as the Euro countries. Here we did not succeed. Because remember, the ECB, the highest decision-making body in the ECB is the Governing Council. Who's on the Governing Council? It's the Eurozone countries. So it's not possible for non-Euro countries to be part of the highest decision-making. That's a problem. In the Single Resolution Board, all member states are equal. They have basically very little influence. So it's the supranational level. Then we have the very difficult issue, which you are alluding to, is the responsibility for costs. We did not want to have a situation where, and you would call us probably unsolidaric, where Swedish taxpayers paid for problems in other countries. It's simply because there's no public support for that. We need to acknowledge that. If we continue to pretend that it's not there, does it make it go away? I'm sorry.
That's not what I said.
Okay, sorry. Need to be provocative sometimes. On the other hand, responsibility for costs on the behalf of banks, that's the whole idea of the banking union. Banks in one country are to pay for banks in other countries. So this is the way it's going to work. Then we have this, and here I think we agree. I hope we agree on the last point too, that would be great. How do you deal with the banking problem? First of all, you tell the truth. You're really transparent about the problems. Then you deal extremely harshly with the bankers and make sure that you have strict rules on it. I would say that the Eurozone management of the crisis is less than perfect on all these aspects. And this is of course a problem, because if you really show what the bad debt looks like, then you need a lot of money to recapitalize the bank, and you don't have the money. So that's why they keep all the bad debt on the balance sheet. So this is a problem. But the one major concern about the crisis management is, of course, the small fund. They simply don't have enough money to deal with the problem. So I don't think we really got there. The role of the Commission is a problem too. Here we have an organization which is involved in decision-making in resolution. They also do the state aid approvals when you have a measure that is taken. I would say that is clearly a conflict of interest. Some people in the negotiations even argue that, well, since it's the Commission that's involved in the decision-making, it's per se not a problem because they know state aid, and argued that decisions within the banking union was not to be subject to state aid approval, just for us who are outside. That was clearly not equal treatment, and we managed to fix that. And then we have the big issue of accountability, and in particular the situation where 5 civil servants take a decision. I have no idea to whom they are accountable. This is a problem from a democratic point of view. So will this work? Well, if you have a banking union with really strict requirements on banks, so they have buffers for problems that they run into, really strict supervision, large fund, and do everything the way you should do, well, then you can look upon this as an insurance scheme. You pay a fee and you're part of a bigger insurance. That's fine. However, as I argued, the jury is still out on some of these points. I do hope the ECB will be successful in supervision. I'm not really sure that the European Union has been totally successful in crisis management. A bigger concern is if you know that if I fail, my banking system fails, all the rest of the guys will help me pay for it. What does that do to your moral hazard? Exactly. And so my end answer is, yes, I think the banking union will work, but it will not work perfectly, and it would not work in the way I would like to see it. And just to give you a picture in the end, maybe I should have drawn it, I see the dilemma of the European Union as a triangle. In one end, you have financial integration, a single market of the whole European Union. In the second end, you have financial stability, the possibility to deal with problems where they arise. And in the third corner, you have national budget sovereignty. And it's simply not possible to reach all three corners at the same time. So one has to go. And some people will argue it's national budget sovereignty. Well, I would say that there's simply no public support, at least not in Sweden, to go that way. But this is where you need to go if you want complete stability. Thank you.
Thank you for an brilliant and very efficient presentation. Now, Philippe, if you would like to have a go at the views expressed here, the more fundamental views of Leif, who seems to adhere to the well-known Murphy's Law. If something is can go wrong, it will go wrong. And then you have the program of Harry Flam, the 3 points for reform or to get us out of the mess. And then last but not least, whether you think the account which we have heard by Johanna of the situation of the banking union, where that will fulfill your criteria for a full banking union. Please.
Thank you. Well, let me start with the simplest. I broadly agree with what Harry said, so I will limit my comments to that. But where I disagree is actually where I also disagree with Leif, which is undeniably the euro has design flaws. But the notion that the reason why there was a credit boom is because of the euro is simply untrue. If you see, there was a broader credit boom across the Western financial system. 7 of the 10 countries that had the fastest credit growth in the pre-crisis years were outside the euro. For every Ireland, there was an Iceland. For every Spain, there was a UK. So the notion that it's because of the loss of the independent interest rates that we had a credit boom, I think is not true. It might have added a bit of extra fuel to the fire, but it certainly is not the fundamental cause of it. And you can see very clearly that some of the countries which had fall interest rates didn't have a credit boom. The best example is Italy. And why? Is because despite having lower interest rates, they maintain very strong domestic credit controls. So I think that it's a combination of one, much too loose monetary policy globally, deficiencies of financial regulation and supervision, and those countries which maintained a tighter control, such as Italy, didn't experience the same problems. Interestingly, of course, the Netherlands also had a massive credit boom. It had a credit boom while running a current account surplus, so it didn't actually suffer from the crisis in the same way that other countries did. But that also contradicts the view that somehow this is caused by having too low interest rates when joining the euro, because the Netherlands already had low interest rates when it joined. My second point of disagreement was clearly Greece is woefully mismanaged, and so is Italy. But the notion that somehow the euro led to excessive government borrowing in Italy, it didn't. It led to excessive government borrowing in Greece, but not Italy. Actually, Italy entered with a much too high public debt level, but the public debt in Greece fell, public debt in Italy fell by, I think, 17% of GDP between 1997 and 2007. So it's not true in the case of Italy that that's what happened. My last point, I think this is a really important point, is this notion of competitiveness. Countries are not companies. This German view of the world that somehow it is competitiveness which is the guide for economic policy is just completely and utterly false. The real aim of economic policy is to boost productivity, not to boost competitiveness. Germany is not a successful economy. Its productivity growth actually over the past decade has been lower than Portugal. All that Germany has done, rather than become more productive, it has held down costs. It hasn't invested, it's suppressed wages, and as a result, in effect, it's pursued competitive devaluation. That gives you a boost while there are other people willing to buy your exports. First China with its industrial growth and the boom in Southern Europe. Now that the rest of the Eurozone is not growing, now that China is slowing and shifting towards industrial development, Germany isn't growing anymore. So let's get away from this idea that competitiveness is the right aim for economic policy. Actually, what we need is to be pursuing policies to boost productivity and in turn paying workers in line with their increased productivity, not paying them at all when they increase their productivity.
Okay. You have no further comments on Leif? Quickly.
Sorry.
Thank you. There are many sources of bubbles and credit expansion, but if you are in a monetary union and you cannot raise interest rates to do something about it, my view is that then the bubble is inevitable with the combination of starting points that you had in Ireland and Spain. In other countries, it could have been avoided, and they could make mistakes so that they do not avoid it, like we did in the late 80s, early 90s in Sweden. But we could not blame a monetary union. We could blame a voluntary fixed exchange rate regime. We had nobody else to blame. It was our choice. We made the mistake ourselves. But the Irish, once they had joined, they had no option. And if they had had credit regulation, so with the freedom of free movement of capital, so Irish homeowners with negative real rates of interest could borrow from Icelandic banks or Austrian banks or from Liechtenstein. Ireland's domestic credit regulations could not have stopped this. They could even have borrowed from a remote country called Great Britain. I mean, they were so integrated, it was out of reach for domestic policymakers. A common view among economists defending this system in Europe is that, well, politicians didn't do their job. If they had tightened fiscal policy, this could not have happened. If you look at the numbers, I think this is an absurd statement. The numbers are so enormous when it comes to the avalanche of a credit boom. So fiscal policy is simply not big enough, no matter how you look at it. And it's even more absurd if you look at it from the political point of view. Imagine the finance minister or prime minister of Ireland saying, we are the fastest growing country in Europe. We have big surpluses. Wealth is rising. The British politicians call us the guiding star of policy making. But now we have to do something. We have to fire teachers. We have to cut pensions. We have to reduce the benefits for everybody, and we have to raise taxes on cars and houses. Why? Well, to create room for more shopping malls, more condominiums in the Mediterranean, more new cars for people who borrow. Can you imagine in a democracy? This is the content of those economists saying fiscal policies should have been tightened to make room for the credit expansion. I think economics and politics must be coherent, and that analysis is not. Thank you.
I didn't say that, though.
Oh, absolutely.
Bengt, Dennis.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I would like to make a few comments to where the chairman started this morning and what Philippe said, pointing to the difference in growth rates between the United States and the Eurozone, actually the whole of Europe. And I think, Philippe, you were quite right when you said that we have a private debt overhang in the Eurozone. And that, in my view, explains quite a lot why we have so slow private consumption growth in Europe compared with the US. And it all boils down to the mortgage loan, the treatment of mortgages. In the US, you can, in many states, just walk away from the mortgages. Or in other states, you have bankruptcy, personal bankruptcy rules that are very fast. You talk about weeks, at most a couple of months. In Europe, it's quite the opposite. You have bankruptcy rules that the processes take years and years, and in some countries, you never walk away from the debt, the mortgage debt. I think that's an important factor. The other factor, I don't think you mentioned it, was the difference in gross capital formation between the United States and Europe. For a long, long time, very many years, decades actually, we have seen a very negative trend compared with the US as to gross capital formation in Europe. I think that's an important factor. And thirdly, you mentioned the banking system. I fully agree with you, but I would develop it and say it's a weakness of the European financial system. There are many weaknesses. First of all, the the European banking system is very weak and less robust than the American system. And I don't think AQR and the stress testing will change anything of that. Secondly, the transition mechanism in monetary policy doesn't work in Europe. So you have very low policy rate, but high lending rates to corporates and households in many of the vulnerable countries. That I think is extremely important. And thirdly, you have different financing of corporates. In Europe, you have bank lending as the main issuer of debt to corporates. In the US, you have a variety of sources. Bank lending is just one, but you can go directly to the market, you can use other vehicles, and it makes a lot of difference. And fourth factor, I don't think mentioned by anyone, is a decline in potential growth rates. I think the IMF said that almost in all the Euro states, there is a decline in potential growth rates. That applies also to Eastern Europe. And if you look at the emerging markets, there's a drastic decline in potential growth rate since 2011. It all boils up to the conclusion you made, and that I fully share, that we'll have a prolonged stagnation in Europe. Structural reforms are important, not to trigger growth, but to sustain growth. Monetary policy, conventional or unconventional, will not change anything, will not trigger investment funds. I don't think there will be just mostly a shuffling around of existing funds, no new money coming on. So the key words for me to trigger a change is something goes wrong in Germany, so they have to shift the position. Secondly, the banking system has to be fixed. And foremost of all, of course, to see that demand is coming, domestic demand is coming in all the Eurozone countries. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Bengt. You really brought up, I think, if I may express a personal view, this major Gordian knot, and what we see where measures are taken again and again via the monetary channel, which doesn't work. And why does one not use the fiscal path? Well, for obvious political reasons, I guess. Then you have to show what you are doing, whereas as the monetary channel is well, understandable for a very limited group of people. But the results are there, the very meager results. Well, I don't know if Harry and Johanna wants to have some comments, and then Philip.
You want to start? You can start.
Yeah, I think we both are right on the credit boom. I think there are two conditions necessary. First of all, you have to have regulations in the credit market that permits a boom to start and go on. And second, you have to have a credit market that is supplying the funds that are demanded. And so in some countries, the credit market conditions, especially in the mortgage market, were such that there was no credit boom like in France and Italy. But in some countries, you had the conditions as far as regulations go, but you didn't have much credit. And when you had the credit, the boom started.
Okay, Johanna, please.
Sure. A really quick way to get growth is to expand credits. It's very good going up, and it's really, really bad going down. Sometimes when I've been out speaking about financial crisis, I have something I call the poisonous three, or the recipe for trouble. If you have large debt, either private or public, you have rapidly rising asset prices, particularly in real estate, or even worse, commercial real estate, and add a big financial or a large financial sector to that, you're bound for trouble. Look at Ireland, Iceland, Spain, and you can add a fourth component, which is a large construction sector. So if you want to avoid something, avoid those four components. I would say Swedish banks learned the lesson from the early 1990s, that credits are good in good times and really bad in bad times. On the other hand, they went across the Baltic Sea and did the same mistake they did in Sweden 20 years earlier. We came really close to huge problems there. In terms of what you need, one of the reasons was we had too lax requirements. So that's why I'm a bit concerned that when we wanted to have really strict requirements on banks, the agreement in the EU was to cap our possibility. We were quite a few member states that struggled to have really strict requirements, but the other ones said to us, and when I asked, what's the problem? You don't have to have the same strict requirement that we do. They said, well, no, Johanna, you make the rest of us look bad. And this is a problem, because here we have the key, and going to the cost of the bailout, which was huge in many countries. I mean, Ireland is a disaster example of that. And the simple reason is they paid too much for the shares. They paid 70 cents on a dollar when it was worth 30. Why did they do that? Well, if they paid the proper price, they would own the whole banking system, and they didn't want to do that because they believed in market economy. So here is why it cost so much money, and it ended up in government debt.
That's not quite true. I mean, that's partly true, but the main reason is because his main reason they made a mistake of guaranteeing all the bank debt, and when that guarantee expired, Jean-Claude Trichet said, if you don't go through with the guarantee, we'll cut off liquidity to Irish banks and be forced out of the euro. And to my view, that is an outrageous abuse of power by an unelected technocrat. But that's where the 64 billion comes from. In terms of the gentleman there, I mean, I agree with everything you say, so my response to that is very short.
Okay, please, you have been raising your hand constantly, so at last...
I would just like to add to...
Sure.
My name is Flavian. I'm not a very well-known person, but anyway, I just would like to add one thing to what Harry Flam said, which I might be a little bit of a stranger in this company because I'm completely against the European Union, but I am completely in favor of fixed exchange rates and monetary unions. So I agree completely with Professor Flam on the issue of fixed exchange rates and monetary unions. However, what I think you might have overlooked when you talked about the mechanisms that I agree that a fixed exchange rate or a monetary union in itself is not dangerous, but what has been completely overlooked in the debate in Sweden, I think, is the function of the clearing system, that there is unlimited credit facility once a payment within the Eurozone crosses a border. And if you look at the Eurozone, you can see that Germany, which is the largest member state of the Eurozone, has less percentage of the payment traffic, so to say, via cross borders. So that will mean that German monetary policy will automatically be less inflationary than in the rest of the Eurozone. Whereas that country, which has the highest percentage of cross-border payments, probably is Cyprus, because Cyprus is the smallest member state of the Eurozone. And Cyprus has the worst macroeconomic situation, and Germany the best. And I think that's quite logical. So I think that the first thing that must be done is that the clearing between the member states of the euro area must be on a market basis. It cannot be that the ECB is always the guarantor of the solvency of the counterpart when a payment is crossing borders in the Eurozone. That was just what I wanted to add to your contribution.
Somebody in the panel wanting to comment on the clearing system? No, that was a statement. Please, over there, could you... can I have a micro? Could you introduce yourself?
My name is Susanne Palme, Swedish Broadcasting Corporation. I was just interested in knowing what you expect from the stress tests of the ECB that will be published on Sunday.
That's a good
Very
question.
pertinent question.
And it allows me to actually talk a bit about the banking union. I have been skeptical from the beginning that the premise of the banking union is national supervisors are captured by their banks, which is true, and therefore we're going to create a pan-European supervisor which is independent. But that's not true. The ECB is not independent of banks. It clearly has acted repeatedly throughout this crisis to further the interest of French and German banks. More generally, it is resisted the moves to impose losses on creditors as part of bank resolution, or indeed, so I think it's going, despite what the market thinks, I think the ECB is going to go easy. I think the AQR already does go easy. For example, it excludes whole classes of assets on the balance sheets of German banks. What I think they'll do is they'll look tough by singling out a few problems in less important countries, and that will allow them to paper over bigger difficulties. In terms of the stress tests are a joke. I mean, they don't even include the possibility of deflation. We're 0.3% away from that. And everyone knows that if we do have deflation, it's going to wreak havoc with banks' balance sheets. So the stress tests are really of very little use. Though, of course, you can do your own personal stress tests by looking at the state of banks' balance sheets. And last but not least, the reason why, despite the fact that people say that the ECB has an interest to be more rigorous than before, actually it also has the power to cover it up, because it has the power to provide unlimited liquidity to banks, and it's been drowning them in liquidity. And therefore, that allows you to paper over problems and certainly deny responsibility if anything emerges. So I don't expect it to be the rigorous assessment that is needed. At the moment, though, markets seem disposed to give the banking system the benefit of the doubt as part of the sort of general flood of money there has been into Southern Europe over this year. In terms of, I think Sweden would be absolutely mad to join the banking union. I mean, absolutely mad. You're not in the euro, and you will suddenly get involved in that whole nightmare mess thing with the people ultimately taking decisions who don't give a damn about Swedish interests. They care about their own interests, and I think it would be completely and utterly mad to do that.
Oh, I was just going to ask you, but you already said what. Do you want to add something more about this stress test?
On the stress test and the AQR, I think we're becoming increasingly better. I mean, I was involved in the first stress test in 2009 during the Swedish presidency, and actually I had to struggle with the finance ministers to actually put down the average result. So I think we've come a far way, but no, it won't be perfect, because as you say, they've excluded some asset classes, and I think the whole point of giving banks liquidity was that they could earn money over the year, thus creating more capital for them until the stress test was come. So I think it was a sort of calculated idea. In terms of the banking union, I think you're touching on an issue which is very interesting and very difficult. It is, are small and large member states equal on a EU level? And I think you're about right there, that it wouldn't be Swedish interests that are catered for.
Okay, Leif?
So let's agree that the advice to the new incoming government, who we know nothing about on these issues, let's agree that the advice from this panel is to stay out of this mess. Can we agree?
Absolutely.
Yes. I don't know about the previous government either, in fact. Do you?
Well, this is part of the previous government.
Yes, but did they arrive at the conclusion and make it public?
No, because the negotiations just concluded. So we were about to make the decision.
And you have not made up your mind?
I made up my mind. No, the government in whole did not reach a conclusion.
Were they divided? Were they split? Were they or is it just...
I can speak for the moderate party.
And they were against it?
Okay, any more final comments from the panel? I would venture, before giving the floor to Lars Anell for a summing up and conclusions to be drawn. Just to remind you about we have got different proposals for how to bring us out of the mess. There are others also who have identified possible paths, and I will mention them. They are familiar for all of us who read the Financial Times, but for example, Münchau's 3 possible routes. One is secular stagnation, we go on. It's the kind of Dr. Pangloss solution. We live in the best possible worlds. Second is a political union with Eurobond, fiscal union, transfer mechanism, and real banking union, and that is obviously his priority. And then third, a breakup of the Eurozone into a more well-functioning part, and the others given the possibility to recover. We had Hans Werner Zinn here the other day, and he also gave priority to a debt conference with the write-downs of debts. He also includes temporary exits, so the club should be open for exit and re-entry. And then in the long run, he favors a kind of Swiss or US confederation with no bailing out of states, actually. But of course, this is a very long perspective, I guess. With these comments, can I ask Lars to try to sum up? Ska få den här.
Does it function? Yes, it does. Yeah, I don't like to speak with a microphone. I like to speak with my hands, which actually reminds me of an episode in the life of the European Union when they discussed how would the European Union become more popular, and it should be fun, you should like it and so on. So they actually, I mean, this is a true story. They engaged a group of consultants to produce funny stories about the European Union. And that was, of course, about the nationalities of the different of the Union. And there was one story which was about an Englishman, a French guy, and an Italian. They were prisoners of war, and they were tortured. And one would want to see how long would they keep silent before they spoke. And the French guy, he came out of after 5 minutes having spoken because he couldn't stand torture. And the Englishman, he got away with 10 minutes. But the Italian guy, he just didn't come out. And then everybody said to him, how could you endure the torture? You didn't speak at all. How could I speak? My hands were tied behind my back. And sorry, that was not the fun part of it. The fun part of it was that once they had produced all these funny stories, they realized we need to explain this. So there is an explanation here. This should not be interpreted as if French people and English people are less courageous than Italians. It could be the other way around. And all the other stories were also explained so the European populace would understand not only the point, but the rest of it. Well, so that's why I have this thing. Does it work? Well, anyway, I mean, I will start with the first part of it. I mean, you didn't say summing up. It said the concluding remark. But, I mean, I've always started, and I think that is important, with what it is all about. I mean, this is a group of countries. This is a union which allows groups of countries to achieve something which they cannot achieve on their own. And that's a very good definition of what should be done in Brussels and what should be done at the national level. There was a discussion here between Anna and Jesper whether they were federalist or not. I've tried to say that for me, federalism, that's just a matter of where you take the decisions. For me, it's a neutral term. I think it's unfortunate in a way that you say some people are federalists and some people, I mean, we actually want to take the binding rules about the internal market in Brussels. That's a federal decision. We have accepted, whether we like it or not, a federal legal system. The European Court of Justice is a very federal institution, and it has been like that for a long time. So for me, the key issue has always been to discuss what should be done in Brussels. And then I think it is actually possible to discuss it in terms, what is the added value in terms of those things that we couldn't achieve on our own. And then some people said that the solution would be to introduce the veto. I think that might have been misunderstood, but I think that would be a mistake. I would, instead of the veto, go for more yes for flexible integration. First of all, I think that there are some things that should be taken back to the natural level. But if we are now in 2014, there are, or at least a number of countries are saying that we would like to go forward. We would like to deepen integration. I think we could actually call their bluff in a sense, because I don't really know what they're talking about. But if they want to do that, there is really no reason to stop countries from deepening the integration if it's in line with two basic principles. One is that this should, of course, not undermine the rights and obligations of other countries. It has to be non-discriminatory in that sense. And it should be open so that all countries can join later. I think that for me is the key issue. So flexible integration, which Mr. Lundgren has produced one of our reports about, is the way forward. And it has been prohibited for a very long time, but after Amsterdam and a number of other conferences, it's now possible for a large enough number of countries, but it's not really promoted, it's not encouraged, and I think that it should actually be encouraged. Then about the Eurozone, a few words about the Eurozone. I was actually thinking about, could I disagree with you, Philippe, on one thing, and I will start by disagreeing on this, when you said that there was something about the Greeks and their money, and there I disagree with you. That is one of the basic problems. It's not their money. They don't have their own money any longer. It's the European money. And that is funny, because that is something that's never been pointed out. I went back, I followed these negotiations quite closely, and I've written about it. And of course, I remember all the committees and the famous Delors committee with all the central bankers and scientists, and they came to the conclusion after having discussed, is this an optimal currency area? And they said, yes, it is, more or less. And this is on the basis of scientific advice. They had scientific advice. I think Paul Krugman was one of them, as a matter of fact, whether he would like to admit it or not now. But anyway. And of course, they discussed the key issues, that you lose the exchange rate flexibility, that you lose the possibility of adjusting the rate of interest. But there was one other thing which, as far as I can remember, no one said, and that was that once you become a member of this Eurozone, all your national debt will be denominated in a foreign currency. You will not be able to control your currency. So allowing in a country with huge national debt and then transforming that debt into a foreign currency, that was a stupidity in itself. But as far as I remember, maybe you could correct me, but no, you can't, because I have the last word. But if you had, you could have. No, you might have. But I went back and looked. I couldn't find any discussion about this particular problem. And it was quite clear that, Belgium, for example, had a debt of over 100%. Italy had a debt of that. Greeks were coming, was not 100 then, but was increasing very rapidly. But that was not really a discussion. And I agree with very much about everything you've said about this. And I think that, of course, relying, as you said, Misha and others, on monetary policies is pretty ineffective. And I think that we have here almost a laboratory experiment of Keynesian policy of the fact that we are in a liquidity trap. The point of Keynes was not that there might be a slump of which we are coming out. The point was that you can actually get stuck at the level where resources are not fully used. And that was the point he made. How do you get out of that? And how do you get out of that if the interest rate doesn't work? If you have negative real interest rate, and it won't come out. You actually need to put funds in the hands of those that are actually going to do the investments. And that can only be, as I see it now, as a matter of either Europe in itself or the strong government. I'll come back to that a little bit later. Then I also agree with Peter on one point, which I'm very glad to hear someone else expressing very clearly, and that is that when we think about the institutions, I mean, it's very dangerous to allow the Commission to become a political animal. You need, in any civilized organization, some impartial bureaucracy. You can trust them as being independent, impartial, doing their job, but not being part of the political struggle and infighting. That is extremely dangerous. I mean, you need someone who is the referee or not, as someone has said, the captain of one of the teams. Then you tip the balance. And of course, I also agree with those who said that Parliament cannot really be the solution.
Philippe has to leave 4:30 sharp.
I agree with the rest.
Thank you,
but not with the Greek money.
Thank you very much for coming to this strange country with its own currency, but you're going back to another one. So thank you very much.
Yeah, no. Then a few words about the Parliament, of course. I mean, I think it was Voltaire who said about the Holy Roman Empire that it's not holy, it's not Roman, and it's not an empire. But I mean, and the Parliament is certainly not a parliament in the true sense of the word. But there is one thing which is disturbing about it. We are quite often saying that we don't have a European debate. We don't debate the European issues. The problem is, of course, that Parliament doesn't do that either, because in order to exert influence, they need to be unite when they negotiate with the other parties, with the Council and the Commission. So if they are split, they have no power whatsoever. So they, in a way, avoid the true discussion, which is, of course, the heart of any true democracy. I just mentioned that you mentioned, which is quite interesting. I'm also waiting for that, the clash between the European Court of Justice and the German Constitutional Court. That will be very interesting to read after all that the European Constitutional Court have said. I mean, they actually said something already about the European coal and steel community. And that will be very interesting to see if they accept the verdict of the... Then institutional competition, I will not say anything about that, but I mean, it's something that I highly recommend, and it's been recommended by famous people like Nils Lundgren and Thatcher, for example. They have a common view on that, which but there is a very interesting book out on that by a British economist called Evans, which is called The Institutional Revolution. That's a very interesting book, which I had a read with great interest. Then the banking union, and I would have a question to you when you said, I mean, you have been negotiating something that you don't believe in. That must be an interesting experience, as a matter of fact. I mean, I was ambassador in Brussels when we negotiated the membership of the European Union, and I actually, after all, believe that we should become members of the European Union. It may not sound like that when I'm talking now, but I still think that's a good thing. But I've never experienced that of negotiating something. I don't want this to happen. But I think I agree with you that we should not join the European Union, the banking union. But when I think about the institutions of Europe today, there is actually only one institution that is truly almost independent, and that is, of course, the European Court of Justice. I mean, they are independent, and there is a rather straightforward set of taking decisions. All the others are sort of mixed up with each other. I mean, even the other institutions are the decisions become part of a sort of political compromise. Then finally one point. I mean, the thing you referred to was the Target 2 system, wasn't it? I mean, the clearing system, which is very interesting, because I've been in several discussions and experts have said, I didn't know that. I mean, that's almost completely unknown to people, that behind all these discussions, all these paragraphs in the... Yeah, but no, I just want to say, I think your point was very interesting and very important. But let me just end that it seems that we agree more or less, and I certainly agree with this, that there are three components in any kind of solution. One is that it's not enough to do it with a monetary means. We need to increase demand in the sense that money is being used by someone to invest. That has to be one. And it has to be done either, as a matter of fact, by the European Union itself or by the strong governments. Of course, that will be refused. No one is going to allow the European Union to do it. But there is actually a very large blueprint for investments in European infrastructure that could be implemented if we allow the European Union to do it. And you could actually do it on a cost basis, that actually the users are paying for that kind of infrastructure. It's not an impossible idea, but certainly also the strong economies will have to do their part in increasing demand. You have to deal with the long-term structural problems on the supply side. Some people think that Keynes forgot that. He didn't. I mean, it was evident that you need to do that also, and you need to restructure the debt. It's a tough thing, but it's completely durable if we really want to get out of this situation. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Lars. You ended on a positive note, at least after these hours of depression, psychological depression. But you also raised some issues which we will come back to. We are planning another seminar based on your book on democracy in Europe, which is a subject which has not been sufficiently discussed in Sweden. So once again, big thanks to the speakers, Peter especially, who has come here, and the rest of you. I think at the end we came to opening up a number of interesting perspectives which helped us both in technical detail when it comes to the banking union. I was reminded of this German saying, es ist ja ordentlich desorganisiert, es könnte auch chaotisch sein. We'll see what happens there with the Swedish government's position. And thank you very much, Lars, for these concluding remarks. Thank you very much.